What's up guys, Sagi here, and welcome to another Tech Gear Talk. Now most of you probably don't know this, but I was a Nikon shooter back in the days. The D3 was my go-to, then the D4, but then when the Canon 5D Mark II came out and I decided to go more in the direction of video, then everything changed. Today I'm going to pull a 180 and go back to Nikon with the new Z50. It's the first APS-C mirrorless camera from Nikon, and Nikon really needed to release this body to compete with similarly priced options from Canon, from Sony, from Fuji, and Panasonic. It'll be interesting to see how this measures up, but either way, it's nice to see another brand jump into this space, which means more competition and better value for us. The specs are super impressive. It handles really well and it has very good high ISO performance and dynamic range. And it has features like eye detection and some pretty impressive video features. Now I've been using it for a few months now, and Nikon did a lot of things right with this camera. And still there are a few opportunities for improvement. So I'll go over both the good and bad, and hopefully I can help you make a buying decision. I'm gonna walk you through a detailed review, show you some sample photos and video footage, and then also talk about who I think this camera would work for. At around $850, the Z50 is in direct competition with other APS-C cameras like the Sony a6400, the Fuji X-T30, and the Canon M6MKII. I'm gonna cover what I liked and what I didn't like about the Z50, but first I'm gonna very quickly go over some overall key features in case you're just starting your research. So the Z50 features a 20.9 megapixel APS-C CMOS sensor and the X-Speed 6 processor. It uses a 209-point autofocus system when using the EVF or the LCD. It has a 3.2-inch 1.0 million dot flip LCD touchscreen. You can record it up to 4K 30 frames per second. You can also shoot full HD or 1080p at up to 120 frames per second for slow motion. We've got a 3.5mm mic input, in-body 1080p and 4K time-lapse, plus interval shooting, which is really exciting. And finally, Wi-Fi and Bluetooth for remote control and easy file transfer. All right, so now that we're done with that, let's dive in deeper and talk about how those features actually impact real-life use. And I want to start out by quickly talking about the sensor and the processor. And you can feel free to skip around if there's a particular section that you're interested in. I have timestamps in the description. Now, the Z50 uses Nikon's DX format 20.9 megapixel CMOS sensor, which is less than the 24 megapixels we get with the a6400, the 26 megapixels we get with the X-T30, and definitely the 32 megapixels that we get with the M6MKII. But the sensor has good high ISO or low light performance and a native ISO range of 100 to 51,200, which can be expanded all the way up to 204,800. Not that you'd ever shoot at such a high ISO, but let's take a look at a couple of shots going through the ISO range. I'll talk about this more later on in their own section, but the image quality and the autofocus when using both the live view and the electronic viewfinders have been good when it comes to still and video. The Z50 is an outstanding option if you're looking for a smaller body for portraits, landscape, lifestyle, and street photography. Overall, I can see why I enjoyed shooting with Nikon all those years. The image quality is really nice right out of the camera. The JPEG color processing is good, and noise reduction is not overly aggressive. As far as dynamic range, the Z50 performed very well, retaining details in the shadows and the highlights when shooting in challenging, contrasty scenes. I was happy with the footage that I was getting with the flatter profile, and for stills, both RAW and JPEG were on par or better than its peers. And moving on to the processor, Nikon is using the X-Speed 6, which is the same powerful processor that we saw on the Z6 and the Z7. And that helps deliver some of the impressive features that I'll mention later on in this video. Now, simple operations like startup, going from shooting to preview mode, or just in and out of the menu and selecting features or settings are very fast. So the camera is off. I'm going to hold down the shutter, turn it on. and that's how long it took it to turn on, acquire focus, and take a picture. If you've watched any of my videos before, you know that one of the features that I look at with every camera that I test is continuous or burst shooting. And this lets me just hold down the button and the camera will just keep on firing. This is a nice feature if you're photographing kids running around, if you're at a sporting event trying to photograph your pets, or anytime you're shooting any fast moving subjects. All right, so let's test this out. All right, so the Z50 can shoot at up to 11 frames per second at full resolution. And if you're willing to work with 8 megapixel files, you can go all the way up to 30 frames per second. Now, of course, you're getting smaller files, but if it's critical that you capture a specific moment, it's definitely worth it. Now, 11 frames per second is pretty good. It should be plenty for what your casual shooter will ever need. So if you take your kids to a soccer game, a basketball, football game, it doesn't matter. The speed isn't really going to be a restriction. Now, of course, if you're a professional sports photographer and that's all you do, there are other cameras on the market that would give you faster burst shooting and give you additional frames to choose from. By the way, if this is your first time here and you like what you've seen so far, go ahead and hit the subscribe and notification button, and also leave me a comment so that I can say hello. Going back to the Z50, it can record internally at up to 4K 30 frames per second with a 30-minute limit, and you can record externally without this time limit using the clean HDMI out. Now, both options give you excellent footage and a ton of color info to work with when you're grading the footage in post-production, and I'll talk more about the flat color profile when I get to that section. Now, finally, having a clean HDMI out also means that you can use the Z50 for live streaming with continuous autofocus and face detection. Now, moving on, and I say this a lot, but one of the most important things to me with every piece of gear that I use is ergonomics, both in terms of handling and the user interface. And this is something that I think is overlooked by a lot of people when they're choosing a camera. They focus on specs, but not the actual user experience. Now, the Z50 has a fantastic grip. It's super deep and it feels very, very secure, and essentially every point of contact with the camera is covered with this rubbery, grippy material. If I'm comparing it to the X-T30, A6400, or the M6 Mark II, it's the most comfortable to hold and in my opinion has the best grip. This becomes even more important when you're traveling and you're constantly putting the camera away and getting it out, when you're using larger lenses, using an adapter, or when the camera gets a little wet. So I really like this design by Nikon. I always say that as technology advances, manufacturers are able to make certain components smaller, but I think it's important to strike a balance between performance, ergonomics, and portability. And if you watched my review of the Sony RX100 Mark VII, I almost dropped that camera every time I picked it up. Now, overall, the Z50 feels super solid. It offers some weather sealing, but from what I read, the pop-up flash makes it not quite as sealed as the Z6 or 7. If you're looking for something that's larger, heavier, and more powerful, and offer weather sealing, check out the Z6 or 7, but of course, expect to pay accordingly. I like that Nikon gives us a front and rear dial for aperture and shutter speed, and there's a designated ISO button so you can hold it down and then use the rear dial to change the value. Now, switching from photo to video mode is done using the small switch that's located right next to the mode dial. And we also have a pair of custom buttons right here, right by the lens, which is something pretty unique. Now, when I first saw them, I was thinking there's like no chance that I would ever use them. But when it actually came to shooting with the camera, I ended up using them maybe more than any other custom button on any other camera. I have this top button set to white balance so I can quickly hold it down and then make a change using the rear dial over here, and then just continue to shoot. And then the lower one I have set to autofocus mode, and again, I'm able to quickly switch between modes, and if I need to go to manual focus, I can do that without ever having to change my grip. Now, there's no joystick on the back of the camera, so you have to use the D-pad on the back to control the autofocus point, or you can just use the touchscreen and click wherever you want it to go. Now, on top of the camera, we also have the exposure compensation button. a dedicated record button, and a mode dial. Now this mode dial obviously lets you very quickly change from manual to aperture, shutter priority, or just complete auto. They also have a couple of user-defined profiles, effects, and scene modes. Now the Z50 has a very nice built-in 2.6 million dot EVF. It's smaller than what you get from the Z6 or 7, but it's still nice and bright. It's really great to have for stills, especially when I shoot portraits. I like to use the EVF rather than the LCD. And even for video, it's a great feature to have in case it's really bright outside and you can't see anything on the LCD. Now in the back of the camera, there's a dedicated monitor mode button, which lets you switch between the Z50, automatically switching between the EVF and the LCD when it detects you putting the camera up to your face, and going to a mode where it's always on the LCD or always in the EVF. And I love the fact that you can do this without having to go into the menu. On the bottom right, we have the directional buttons, a menu button to access the main menu system, a trash button to delete the images, and an image preview button. Now the last button is the I button, which brings up an awesome quick menu. It's similar to what we see on the A6400 because the Z50 gives you the ability to customize the options with the 12 settings that you most frequently use. And the I menu can be viewed on the LCD and in the viewfinder, which is really useful because if you have the camera up to your eye, you don't have to put it down to make these changes. You can also customize different options for stills and video, so that when you switch modes, the options on the I menu change automatically. And this is great because some of the options like flash for stills or audio levels for video don't really apply to the other modes, and this way you actually do get 12 dedicated settings. This quick menu is one of my favorite features, and when coupled with the touch functionality on the screen, it provides one of the best user experience I've found. And there's a really cool feature about this touchscreen, which I'll talk about later on. Now, one of the things that I didn't like about the quick menu had to do with picture style. If I changed it while I was in stills mode, it would also switch for video. So I'd have to make sure that I remember to change it back when I switch to photo. So for example, if I had it set to flat profile when I'm shooting video, then I switch to stills, it would start taking pictures in flat mode, which is not really what I want. And honestly, I would forget it all the time. And what's strange is that this didn't happen for all the features. Like if I changed autofocus mode, it would remember my settings for stills and video. And as I switched, it would change it on the back. So that was kind of strange. Nikon's menu system was pretty easy to use. There are dedicated areas for photography and video, so you don't have to worry about overlapping settings. Considering that this was the first time I used a Nikon menu in like 10 years, I was really happy with it. Now moving on to the battery, the Z50 uses the EN-EL25 lithium ion battery, which is rated for about 300 shots. This is similar to what we saw on the M6 Mark II. I like the fact that Nikon included a battery charger, thank you, so that if you get additional batteries, you can charge the battery while using the camera. All right, so now moving on to this left side of the camera, we can see that we have an HDMI port for external recording or live streaming, and a micro USB port. Now this port can be used to charge the battery in the camera, but you can't use the camera and charge it at the same time. And I really wish that Nikon would have used USB-C because, well, USB-C. Finally, we have an external mic input, which lets us connect an external microphone and gives us much better audio. And I'll give you some audio samples later on in this video so that you can hear the difference. Now, moving on to the bottom of the camera, we have the battery compartment, which also houses the SD card slot. And I like that Nikon positioned this compartment fairly far away from the Q20 so that you can switch out the battery and the SD card without having to take the Z50 off of a tripod or having to remove the quick release plate. Now this is a UHS 1 card slot. I really wish that Nikon would have used a UHS 2 compatible card slot to allow for faster read and write speeds. Now the last feature that I want to talk about is the pop-up flash. Obviously it's not as powerful as an external flash, but if you need some fill light during the day or if you're shooting during golden hour, you can get some pretty decent results. Okay, so now let's talk about resolution, frame rates, and image quality. So for stills, the Z50 has a maximum image resolution of 5568 by 3712. That's going to be plenty for what most people would ever need out of this type of camera. It can of course shoot in both JPEG and RAW, so you can decide just how much information you want to capture depending on what you plan on doing with the images in post-production. And I usually have it set to shoot both JPEG and RAW so that I can have JPEGs for any quick posts that I might want to make, and then RAW if I want to actually do some advanced editing. Now, the image quality for stills was fantastic, and I felt almost nostalgic to revisit Nikon. It's kind of like hanging out with an old friend that you haven't seen for a while, and I really enjoyed shooting with it. And in my opinion, the image quality is on par with the best APS-C options at this price point. The images were very sharp and with excellent dynamic range and beautiful JPEG color processing. Even in JPEG, skin tones appeared natural, and street photography and architecture shots came out looking really nice. Again, if you're shooting RAW, this isn't a big deal, but I like to be able to use some shots right out of the camera, or maybe with just a slight edit for quicker social media posts, which again is why I usually shoot with both JPEG and RAW, so that I have both options available to me. Before I continue with the image quality section, if you like what you've seen so far, let me know by giving this video a thumbs up. And if it's your first time here, go ahead and hit the subscribe and notification buttons so you can stay up to date on all the latest gear. All right, so moving on to video, the Z50 can record 4K at 24, 25, and 30 frames per second, and Full HD or 1080p at 24, 25, 30, 50, 60, 100, and 120 frames per second. And it's nice to see that Nikon didn't make the mistake Canon made of removing 24 frames per second, which of course they later on corrected with the 90D and also should be updating with the M6 Mark II. Also, I love that you don't have to choose between NTSC and PAL, and you have all the options available to you in one menu. Of course, 100 and 120 frames per second can be used to slow down the footage in post-production. And it's nice that you get the option to record this footage with audio. If you want to have the camera slow down the footage for you, there are also built-in options for in-body slow motion in 24, 25, and 30 frames per second. Now, the Z50 captures video using the full width of the sensor, which is great. We have the standard 30-minute record limit in 4K and 1080p, which is the industry standard, or you can choose to record externally via the HDMI out. 4K footage from the Z50 was nice and detailed, and I like the fact that there's no additional crop in 24, 25, or 30 frames per second like on some competitors. This makes it a lot easier to get wide-angle shots when shooting in 4K, and means that you can maintain your composition regardless of frame rate. Now, going to 1080p, again, I got sharp and detailed footage. Unlike with the Z6 or Z7, Nikon didn't include N-Log with the Z50, but there is a picture profile called flat, which retains more of the detail in the shadows and the highlights and gives you more room to work with in post. All right, now let's talk about the autofocus, which hasn't always been a strength for Nikon when using contrast detection with DSLR systems. But Nikon has definitely made some improvements. Is it industry leading? Not quite, but you can see that Nikon knows where it needs to go. The Z50 uses a 209-point autofocus system, which is somewhat of an offshoot of the system used on the Z6 and 7. They're very straightforward autofocus modes, and the system worked really well for me. I was able to very quickly figure out which mode to use for different situations. I mentioned earlier that the function 2 button on the front is set to focus mode and autofocus area mode. So I was easily able to switch between single point to dynamic area, small and large areas, and then to auto area without ever having to go into the menu. For modes, we have manual focus, single, and continuous autofocus. We also have an option called auto switch, which will allow you to track a subject but then lock autofocus when you half press the shutter. We're getting face and eye detection for photography, which works in auto area mode. If the Z50 detects more than one face or eye, it lets you switch using the D-pad. Now, the system worked pretty well for me, but it's definitely not as good as the A6400. If eyes are not detected, the Z50 will revert back to face detection. And while there are better eye detection systems out there, in most actual portrait type shoots, it was definitely usable. Overall, the autofocus system for stills was very reliable, and I really enjoyed having eye autofocus when shooting portraits. Now, even with it not being perfect, it's nice not to have to worry about the focus point and just concentrate on framing. In addition to face and eye detection, we also have subject tracking. I really like the actual user experience of this feature because you can select the subject directly from the LCD by clicking on it, or you can use the OK button in the middle of the D-pad to activate the tracker, then place it over your subject using the D-pad, and then click OK again to lock on. This is something that I really wish Sony had done with the A66, 64, and 6100 just to improve usability. And moving on to video, honestly, I was ready to be underwhelmed, mostly because of what I remember from older models. But again, it looks like Nikon is moving in the right direction. The autofocus interface is similar to what we saw for stills, but with a lack of dynamic area option, which is definitely not a big deal. There's no eye detection for video, but there is face tracking, which worked really well. And again, it let me select between different faces in the frame. Something else that was really nice to see was that in 120 frames per second, there is still autofocus, unlike with the Canon M6MKII. And in addition, you could still select and track the subject, which is something that the A6400 can't do at 120 frames per second. So to recap my opinion about the autofocus, it worked really well for stills and video. The face and eye detection are not on par with some of the competitors, but it's nice to see that Nikon is moving into this space, and hopefully they can continue to make improvements with firmware upgrades. Next, I want to talk about lens options for the Z50, and I think a lot of people forget to look at this part when they shop for a camera. When I test cameras, I like to use a variety of lenses at different price points to help you get a true feel of what you can expect. Now, the Z50 uses the Z mount, which is the same mount used on the Z6 and Z7. It's great to see that Nikon has adopted a single mount approach to their entire mirrorless line, unlike what we see from Canon with the RF and EF-M lines. That means that you'll be able to swap lenses between the three cameras, while of course having to shoot in DX mode on a full frame camera if you use DX lenses. Now, having said that, there are only two Z-mount DX lenses available from Nikon right now. This 16-50 and a 50-250. They of course cover a significant focal range all the way from 16 to 250, but they are quite limited in terms of speed due to their variable maximum aperture. Now, aside from that, I really enjoyed using both lenses. They're small, they're light. The 16-50 is tiny, it's super versatile, and worked really well on a gimbal. It's a good all-around mid-range zoom, and a definitely lens I would recommend starting with. The 50-250 I ended up using a lot more than I thought I would. It worked well for portraits, and I even ended up using it for street photography. Now, one thing to remember is that because the Z50 is an APS-C sensor and not a full frame sensor, there is a crop factor of 1.5x. That means that you take the focal length of the lens and you multiply by 1.5 in order to get the full frame equivalent field of view. So for example, this 16-50, when I multiply it by 1.5, actually gives me a 24-75 full frame equivalent field of view. What it means is that 16 millimeters on this sensor is not as wide as what it would look like on the Z6, but it would be the same as using a 24mm lens on a full frame sensor. And this is all only really important before you buy your camera. I mean, once you have it, you get the lens, it's as wide as it is, but when you're comparing lenses and sensor sizes, I just wanted to give you a little bit of insight. Now, if you're looking for more lens options, you can of course buy FX or full frame Z mount lenses, at which point you have a lot more options to choose from, including some great fast primes. You can also use older F mount lenses on the Z50 using an F to Z mount adapter, and then you have even more options and definitely more affordable ones. I want to tell you about one last option that I happen to use because I'm primarily a Canon shooter and I have a lot of Canon lenses. So I picked up this Comlight CM-EF NZ adapter, which lets me use my Canon EF and EFS glass on the Z50. Now moving on, let's talk a little about the 1.0 million dot 3.2 inch flip touchscreen LCD. As far as touch functionality, the screen is super responsive and accurate. The touchscreen can be used to navigate and make selections from the menu, select options from the quick menu, initiate subject tracking autofocus, or to select an autofocus point. Now, the touchscreen doesn't have drag to focus functionality and can't be used as a touchpad when the camera is up to your eye, which is a little disappointing. If you've watched some of my videos, you know that I'm a huge fan of fully articulating screens because I feel like they provide so much functionality in terms of positioning, both for photography and video. And this is a feature that's available on even the lower end Nikon DSLRs like the D3500, the D5600, I think the D50-300 too. But instead here, Nikon elected to go with a flip screen, which is the second best choice, except for it flips down. I don't know. You can flip the screen up by more than 90 degrees, which works really well when the camera is below eye level, or if you're shooting with a camera like super low to the ground. You can also tilt it down for situations where the camera is above your head, like if you're trying to shoot over a group of people. But when you want to flip it to face the front, it flips down. Why? I mean, the viewfinder, you can't flip up, I get that. So that works fine when you're hand holding the camera, but if you're in the studio, you can't put it on a tripod and then flip the screen down, obviously, because it's gonna hit the tripod. You also can't vlog with it using something like a GorillaPod because, again, you're not gonna be able to see it if it's flipped behind the GorillaPod. So this is kind of a strange choice at this point in time, especially with so many years after Canon's M5, which received the same kind of criticism. Now visually, the screen is really nice and bright and worked well for me when shooting photos and videos, even in pretty bright conditions. Now, one other thing that's really cool, and I didn't really realize it until I used it for a couple of weeks, is there are these three icons here on the back of the screen. And I wasn't really sure what they were, but they're actually kind of like buttons. So you can actually bring up features using these three icon button things. And that's actually kind of a cool feature. All right, I also want to talk about a few other features that this camera has that may help you make a buying decision. First, I want to talk about image stabilization. So the Z50 does not have in-body sensor shifting image stabilization, so you'll need to look for lenses that offer VR or vibration reduction. That's Nikon's term. It's just like Canon's IS, Sony's OSS, and Fuji's and Panasonic's OIS. The good news is that the two kit lenses are inexpensive and they do offer VR up to 5 stops. Now this could be a deal breaker for some people, but I've lived my whole life without image stabilization from the body. I very rarely, if ever, rely on it for photography, especially with being able to shoot at higher ISO values. And for video, if I really need stable footage, then I'm always on a gimbal or a slider. Again, it's a feature that I'd like to have, but it's not one that I personally require. So next I want to talk about time-lapse, and the Z50 has the best of both worlds. Like some of my Canon cameras, it has in-body 1080p and 4K time-lapse, meaning that the camera will actually compile the time-lapse for you so that it's ready to be viewed. And on top of that, it also has interval shooting, which is a built-in intervalometer. So you can program or take a series of full resolution images, and then you can create a much higher resolution time-lapse in post-production. This also gives you more flexibility when it comes to editing. Both are very simple. You just select the interval in seconds, which is how long you want it to wait between each exposure. You then select how many exposures you want it to take, and this will control how long your final time-lapse will be. Finally, you select whether you want the Z50 to do exposure smoothing for you to ensure that the exposure for each frame is similar to the earlier frames. And you can also select a few other settings, which I'll leave to another video. What's great about this is that you don't need to take individual photos and then process them yourself in post. I recommend that if you're using the in-body time-lapse, you always shoot in 4K, even if you plan on using the footage in 1080p, because you can always resize it, and the larger resolution gives you some cool options in terms of reframing. If you want additional flexibility, then the process is very similar for interval shooting, but it will also allow you to select a start time in case you don't want it to start shooting right away. Next, I want to talk about audio recording functions, which were actually pretty good. On the left side, we have a 3.5mm mic input, which lets us connect an external microphone and then get much better audio quality than we would from the built-in microphone. All right, so this is an example of me recording directly into the Z50 using the built-in microphone. I'm sitting probably about 3 feet away from the camera. I'm in a pretty well-treated room, so this should give you a pretty good example of what recording directly into the Z50 is going to sound like. And now I'm recording using the Rode VideoMic Pro Plus. It's positioned right over here, right out of frame. It's probably about maybe 18 inches away from me. I'm still sitting 3 feet away from the camera. And what's nice about this setup is that I can move as far away as I want and then just bring the microphone with me. So this should give you a pretty good example of what using an external microphone is going to sound like. All I'm going to do in post is just normalize the audio so they're the same volume, but this will give you an idea of what using an external microphone can do for your audio. I'll put some links in the description to a few options that I think would pair well with the Z50, as well as a microphone comparison video I did to help you choose. Now, Nikon didn't include a headphone jack, which would have given the Z50 an edge over the A6400, the X-T30, and the M6MKII, but I'm assuming that they're keeping that for a higher end APS-C model. Now, I love the fact that Nikon is displaying the audio levels on the screen before and during recording, so you don't have to go into the menu to check and set levels like on some cameras. Now, I was also happy to see that I can edit the audio levels while recording. I bring up the I menu and then I make changes using the D-pad or the touchscreen. And this means that I don't have to stop recording to make audio level changes like I had to do with the Canon M6MKII. Now let's move on to connectivity. And the Z50 has built-in Wi-Fi and Bluetooth, which lets you easily pair the camera with a smartphone or a tablet, so you can wirelessly share images and video. Now this is awesome for when you're doing a shoot, or maybe you took some stills and you want to quickly post them to Instagram or Facebook or Twitter, it doesn't matter. You can easily transfer them right to your phone, give them a quick edit, and post them. Now, being able to control the camera remotely from a mobile device is something that I always like. There is a slight delay, but it's an awesome feature and one that I use all the time. I couldn't select a focus mode, but I could select a focus point if I was already in that autofocus area. And I could always see if the Z50 found and was tracking my face. Now for photography, I would use this feature for macro, so that I can take a picture without having to touch and potentially move the camera. All right, so I would love to know what you think about the Z50. Let me know in the comment section if this camera is one that you would consider getting, and then why or why not. I think it's a great option from Nikon, and I'm happy to see that they're getting in the mirrorless APS-C space, because like I said in the beginning, the more competition means better options for us at better prices. If you're looking for a capable APS-C mirrorless camera with great handling, definitely give this camera a look. And the small DX Z-mount lenses also make it a great travel camera. For photography, the 20.9 APS-C sensor gives me excellent image quality, and for video, I got nice and detailed 4K, great 1080p, and awesome slow motion. The autofocus was good, and I enjoyed using face and eye detection when shooting portraits. For video, subject tracking worked pretty well, and the transition from one subject to another was pretty smooth. Ergonomics were extremely good on the Z50. The grip is excellent, the camera is comfortable to hold, and the buttons and dials feel like they're in the right spots. The menu system was simple to use, and the I menu is great because you can customize it for exactly what you need. I like that we're getting uncropped, full sensor readout 4K video at 24, 25, and 30 frames per second, and it's great to have everything from 24 all the way up to 120 frames per second and 1080p. I also really like the built-in 4K time-lapse, interval shooting, 11 frames per second burst shooting, and the 30 frames per second 8 megabyte option. We have a mic input for better audio quality, and I love having the ability to modify gain levels during recording. A few opportunities for improvements are continuing to work on face and eye detection, allowing for the battery to be charged while the camera is running, then maybe adding N-Log to compete with Sony and Fuji, and definitely implementing a fully articulating screen instead of a flip down screen. The body alone sells for around $850, and I'll put links in the description to the body as well as some lenses and accessories that I like. There are always specials and discounts, and the links will automatically be updated with the lowest pricing. I really hope I was able to give you a good overview of the Nikon Z50. If I did, it would mean a lot to me if you let me know by giving this video a thumbs up, and if you're new here, join the community by hitting the subscribe and notification buttons. And then drop me a comment so I can welcome you. For more opportunities for live interaction, make sure that you find me on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at Tech Gear Talk. You know what I always say? Buy it nice or buy it twice. Good luck and see you soon.